Howdy, my name is TK Smith and I am a Philadelphia-based curator, writer, and art historian. I'm here with Ruth Fine, who is an artist, printmaker, painter, independent curator. She's celebrated for a 4-decade-long tenure at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and she has written extensively on modern prints and drawings, as well as African-American art. She's also the widow of Larry Day. Larry Day was an artist and writer born in 1921 here in Philadelphia. He served in World War II, and he was trained at the Tyler School of Art. He had a decades-long career teaching art here in Philadelphia. And we are speaking within Silent Conversations, just one part of a 3-part exhibition titled Body Language, The Art of Larry Day, curated by London-based curator and art historian David Beinman. Silent Conversations surveys the figurative work for which Day was widely known, and along with his architectural motifs often depicting Philadelphia structures and sites of construction. The paintings and drawings that surround us span Day's career and include some of the last works he completed before his death in 1998. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, TK, for that lovely introduction and for being here with me in Larry's show. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely, a pleasure for me as well. The legacy of an artist is not just the protection of the work. It includes protecting their ideas, emotions, and memories. In your marriage with Day, was there much conversation about what would happen to his work, his writing, or his books?
Oh, I wouldn't say there was very much active conversation. I think I met Larry when I was a student at the age of 19, and we were friends until I was 42. When we got married, he was 62. And I think he knew that my respect for the work went back much, much further than the time of our marriage. And because I was a professional, he assumed that I would deal with it in a professional way. It wasn't something we particularly discussed, I wouldn't say. And life makes you do things you might not necessarily do. I lived in a 3-story house outside of Washington, D.C. that had library books on all 3 stories. Each of the 3 stories was lined with bookshelves, and at a certain point, well after Larry died, I decided I had to move to Philadelphia, or wanted to move back to Philadelphia, and had 1 month to disseminate and figure out what to do with everything. And I would say my major regret was that I didn't make a list of our library. So there is no record of Larry's library, and it would be hard to say which was Larry's library and which was mine, but aspects of it would have been clearly his. Yeah. And I'm sorry I can't say what that library was. And of course I've since moved 2 more times, and each time the library has been diminished. I think artists' libraries are extremely important in the sense that it tells you what they're interested in. But in addition to Larry's library, there are 2 file boxes of images that he collected. And in some ways I realized that it's those images that are actually as important as the library was, because I don't think he really worked from library books per se. He worked from images that he collected of all sorts, popular images, or historical images. He never cut up books, but he cut up catalogs and announcements. He didn't particularly cut up magazines either, because one of the things he had were bound annual collections of Art News, Art Forum, Art International, that at a certain point in his life he started binding them year by year. So we had quite an amazing art historical library.
I believe it. 3 stories of books?
Yeah.
The reason I asked that question is because, one, everybody is not gifted or chooses the privilege of marrying not only a curator, but also an artist themselves. You know, like he had the benefit of knowing that you would know what to do with the work, or at least respect it enough to do something with it. I think for a lot of people, when it comes to that time to decide what to do with the legacy of a person, they're left with someone who might have no idea what to do with it, or even the language that the art world speaks.
Well, it's complicated, and it's different for every artist as well.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is to know the artist's history, because things are most likely to be treasured by institutions or people who have connections. So where an artist went to school matters, who the artist's friends are matters, where the artist taught matters, if they taught, if they didn't teach, what did they do? Some artists leave bigger legacies, both in terms of numbers and in terms of influence, and so that's important as well. And I think it's a highly personal situation. I mean, I've been very involved with the Artist Endowed Foundation initiative that Aspen Institute has been working with for many, many years in ways that had nothing to do with Larry's being my husband, but my connections with other artists. Like, I share the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, and so I'm involved with that for that reason. And but the members of that, of which there are a few hundred, are extremely different. Some own a lot of art, some own no art, some own a building that they turn into an artist residency. Some have close connections with the community, and the artist's legacy is tied with the community. It has to do with what age the artist was. Younger artists are forging new ways of working. Many young African American artists have very consciously forged community connections that have been important to both the legacy of the artists who formed, Theaster Gates is one, Titus Keffer is another, Rick Lowe is another, Faith Ringgold is another, and how their legacies moves forward with the community orientation is very different. Some artist foundations are set up to foster the legacy of the artists. Some are set up with closing dates so that they wind down after a certain number of years. Many, many years ago, I was on a foundation that had been set up by Richard Florsheim of the Florsheim Shoes family. Oh. And that was a foundation very much set up to support museum exhibitions by older artists and catalogs of exhibitions or publications about older artists. So this was an older artist who happened to be rich for reasons other than his work, but who wanted to help senior artists. Some people want to help artists under 30. Some people want to help BIPOC artists. So it's highly personal, and it changes. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that you need to be flexible and you need to respond to each situation in its own way.
So did he ever talk about why he liked putting himself in his own work? Because he appears in a lot of the work.
I think the work was about discovering who he is, who he was. I mean, what's interesting to me, and what I would think would be interesting to artists today, is there's so much about portraiture and self-portraiture today. Mm-hmm. I mean, if there's anything that ties the work to the present moment, this precise present moment, it seems to me to be the self-portraiture. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he was part of the group, and he was part of the group.
Do you feel like he was very interested in who the individuals were versus having an individual type to use in his tableau? No, he was very
interested in who they were.
Yeah.
They were his friends. Monica Vitti was the most popular Italian movie star of the moment.
Oh, wow.
This is Monica Vitti. Antonioni's Red Desert movie star.
Antonioni.
Yeah, he was very interested in film. We had a huge film library. That I mainly gave to the head of filmmaking at the National Gallery.
Who is this here?
That's Joan Leon, who was married to Dennis Leon. That's my first husband, and that's me. That's David Pease, who was the head at Tyler and became the head at Yale, and his wife, Julie Pease. That's Eileen Goodman, the first wife of Sidney Goodman, their daughter, Amanda. That's Daniel Goldman, who was the son of Doris Gray and Stuart Goldman, who were divorced. Doris Gray lives in Philadelphia now. Stuart, I think, still lives in Cincinnati, and that's Heidi, Larry's cat. He always had a cat.
The cat.
And she was called Heidi because she hid most of the time. And this is Natalie Charko and Mitzi Melnikoff, who were in that painting.
That painting.
And Natalie Charko donated many works to Woodmere now. For this at the time of the show. Got you.
Yeah. Wow. So what we're seeing too is an intergenerational community of artists and creators. Mm-hmm. But you said he was more of a loner kind.
And that's Larry. No, Larry wasn't. It's complicated. I mean, he was a loner who would go out to a mall if he needed to be with people. He would go to a shopping mall and walk around.
Was he more of like a voyeur then? Like besides when he played games, I imagine.
What do you mean by voyeur?
Well, it seems like he's more observing in this.
Yeah, he's certainly an observer, and in the own work, and a participant. And you'd come into the studio and he would, these are all photographs related to the painting that he combined. He would never, we were never set up like that. So they're combined. He mainly combined photographs.
I was reading in the catalog, I believe in your memory portrait, you talk about how he had organized things based on subjects and themes that I suppose were files and clips and notes that he would use to teach with, which I think is another privilege, of having an artist who is also a teacher, who has to have some kind of organization, And I imagine, when someone passes, there's so much that you're left with, more stuff than you can just conceive of. And I'm thinking raw art materials, I'm thinking dates you have to cancel, appointments you have to cancel, I'm thinking toothbrushes, all of the things that you're left behind with that you then have to sort through. And having a house that was 3 stories, I imagine that was an immense, including studios, or were there studios in the home?
There were studios. Larry sometimes had studios in his home, sometimes he had separate studios. When he died, he was actually in an apartment in Philadelphia, Elkins Park. He had moved back here at the very end of his life and spent the last 6 months pretty much entirely here with him. And there was a studio in the, that's true for artists and for non-artists. The work was all in Washington, but the studio and his living space was here. You sort through, and you can only do it based on what you know. Everybody has to do it based on what they know.
When you're crafting a legacy for someone, that negotiation becomes, what do you give to the world? What do you give to the world in order to represent this person and how significant they were as an artist, as an educator? And what do you keep for yourself? And what do you let go of? I'm thinking you're going through this endless sorting process, and you're learning more things about him than you might have known when he was living. Is there anything you discovered about him going through his objects or sorting through the work?
The most interesting thing I learned was that he always spoke about his year of 1952 in Europe, and there never was a year in Europe. He was in Europe for about 4 months. And I found that out by looking at the passport.
Oh, yeah.
And when he left and when he came back. So this year in Europe didn't exist. So that was interesting. We each remember things as we remember it. I was talking with someone a few days ago about what a fact is, and if somebody says something to you, this was a journalism student who was talking about how you need to be, especially in our litigious age, how you need to be very careful what you state as a fact. And I learned long ago in my curatorial work that a fact was something I could have told to me 3 times by different people who were not in the same room when either of them told it. And that happened, but it happened rarely. In a way, a legacy evolves, and it's not necessarily what you do. I had a former student of Larry's who asked me for years for an overview collection to be donated to Hollins University in Virginia, where Larry had been a guest professor, and it's now the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum. And they have a beautiful collection of his work that was because someone came to me and said they wanted it. Many gifts that I have made were throughout the country because people came and said we would like something of Larry's, or I wanted to give it for a special reason in honor of somebody else. And this goes back a long time. It's highly emotionally charged to work with the works. But it's not, it's a kind of call and response. And you do what you're called to do, and you respond to what you're responding to. I mean, Larry was an important teacher. His students are not only all over the country, but all over the world. There's a former student in Australia who's always stayed in touch, William Kelly, and who made a portrait of Larry and a portrait of me. And his staying in touch with us was what's important. And so it's not like you create it. You're not. None of us has that much control. We like to think we do, but we don't. Just like the exhibition. There's a group of works that belong to the Rhode Island School of Design. They were given to RISD along with his last group of works, just because of my respect for the RISD Museum. I had no connection with RISD until I forged a connection with RISD. And once it was forged, I had letters from students at RISD telling me which issues of Vogue certain works were quoting.
Oh, wow.
And they stayed in touch with me for years. Larry died more than 20 years ago. So this exhibition and catalog have, in a way, been a long time coming. And they've been greatly admired. I mean, people have come in from all over the country to see the show, which has been wonderful. And people have told me stories about their experiences with Larry, which both told me personally, and there was a wonderful group of oral histories made by Tessa Haas, who was an exhibition assistant. And the main thing that came out of those oral histories was Larry taught me to think. Everyone said again and again, Larry taught me to think. I know he helped teach me to think. He was not my most important teacher, actually. But he certainly, over time, taught me to think. And my spending time with him, just looking at the work. You know, you would look at the work and end up not necessarily knowing what he thought, but knowing how you could move forward to keep the work moving.
Oh, I love this
salmon
story.
color. Yeah, I do too.
I love that he's not very loud, is what I imagine. So
he was never loud, except if he was screaming at a game.
Yeah.
You moved up and sat next to him so you could hear him talk.
Was he
and
good
he
at
would go to a
charades?
party and he would sit down and people would just migrate to him. You know, everyone would take their turn with Larry.
He had a magnetism.
Absolutely. Everyone really respected him and loved him.
That's what I'm getting.
He was a very kind, generous person.
I think my naive tendencies would like to believe that there is a certain amount of power that you bring to this process, you know, and that is me being naive, having not gone through this process, right? Like, I remember working on the air show here at the Woodmere and having a conversation with his widow where she said, there are things that I kept for me and there are things that I am gifting to the Woodmere. He has an archive here, and she helped build that archive here. And everything that every piece of ephemera and diary, journal, image of him came from that archive. And so the show was built around what she was willing to give and what she was not willing to give. Of course, now that you've said what you've said, I understand, you know, well, if I went and talked to somebody else might tell me something that she was not necessarily interested in sharing with the world, because he was so influential and he was a teacher here in Philadelphia. And I think that's... Well,
and he also was a guest critic throughout the country. So, you know, at Indiana University, he was a guest critic. And in Florida, he was a guest critic. So in California, he was a guest critic. His best friend, Dennis Leon, who's in the back in the green jacket of the painting behind us, moved to Oakland, California, and he called Larry to be a guest critic there. So, you know, these you just go where you're asked to go. Westminster College in Pennsylvania. I mean, his students invited him, and he had an impact on the places that he went. I mean, we all have a limited time on this earth. I don't really think about anything as being mine, and I've always liked the ideas of collectors of art also thinking of themselves as trustees, limited trustees. They're taking care of something till they need to pass it on. And for me, the most important thing is to pass everything on. I mean, my own archives are the Archives of American Art, Larry's early Archives of American Art interview in whatever year that was, doesn't matter, but you know, the papers need to, I think, go there. There's a study collection here that I think is very important of 260 small drawings that really give an overview, and a group sketchbooks that give an overview. Sketchbooks are extremely important, I think, and some of his sketchbooks are at the National Gallery of Art in memory of a curator he was close to there. When Anne Darnoncourt died, sketchbooks went to the Philadelphia Museum as a gift from me in Anne's memory. Joe Rischel died this year. There's a painting across the room, Day by Day, that was picked by Ann Temkin for the Philadelphia Museum when Larry died. Well, I gave the drawings related to that to Joe Rischel, or in memory of Joe Rischel, so the drawings related to that are already there. One of those drawings was given to the Metropolitan years ago, Museum in New York. So they're not all together. They don't have to all be together. But I think some kind of logical overview of where things go is helpful. But, you know, it depends on the artist. It depends on the relationships. Power, I don't like the word power. In general, I don't like the word power, but certainly at this time in our world history, I don't like the word power. And I don't know that it is power. It's, it's about making connections and what those connections are and how they help everybody. Larry's interest in drawing, Larry's connection to art history, I mean, he believed totally in the power of art history, not as something that references the past, but something that brings the past into the present and hopefully brings the present into the future. And so that was his concern. But I think there are some institutions that are still more concerned with drawing and with art history. A small version of this exhibition is going to the David Owsley Museum at Ball State University, and that references their interest in drawings and in the notion of the past being important for the present and the present being important for the future. That's a philosophical position. I don't know how widely shared it is. I'm very, very interested in speaking with people of your generation because I think you view the world in very different ways. Someone was talking the other day about what someone said 30 years ago about the younger generation was that they had no intervals, that everything was one on top of the other, one next to the other. And if you look at a TV screen now, there certainly are no intervals. There's the news along the right and the news along the bottom and what's theoretically the main screen. And, so it's not what I grew up with. I grew up with a funny black and white image that wasn't even around when I was born, or at least it wasn't in my house when I was born. Legacy has to do with connections, and legacy is a long-term thing, and we all know that there are artists who get lost in history and then get found again. For me, the most important thing is to have a public presence, and so the catalog, which I think was beautifully done by Woodmere, has a public presence. I believe in books. I actually don't think books are going to go away, no matter how many digital conversions we have. And books are what they are. Digital conversions are not. I mean, I had lots of discs that I didn't convert fast enough, and they are useless. They are unconvertible. So whatever information on those discs is lost. So that's what I think about legacy. I think if works can go into public institutions, great. If they can go to private people who want them to go into public institutions, that's okay too. And you hope for the best because you're not in control.
I think what you're revealing in all of this, to replace the word power with another term, I would use the word generosity. You don't necessarily have to function with the philosophical belief that the work should be shared, the work should be known. I mean, even in your process of telling me just now, you're saying that you're purposely tying Larry's legacy, his sketchbooks, his ephemera, his archive, to the legacies of other people, which is generous. That's a kind of generosity to do, especially to spread it out across multiple institutions, to give it to as many people as possible, to educational institutions like RISD, so that students can continue to learn from the work, so that the work continues to live and influence and teach in a very purposeful way beyond his life. I think that's generous. I think, and I agree, I 100% agree that anyone who purchases art for their private collections should be thinking of the life of that art beyond just when they own it or are able to own it. But it takes generosity to think that way. And the opposite of that, the former term, power, comes from the choice to do that or not, I think. When you purchase a work of art and it becomes yours, you are wielding a certain amount of power to hold whatever potential is in that art for yourself or to share it with the world. And fortunately, you know, in my early, very young career, I found that there is a lot of generosity. You know, I've found, especially and I'm sure you're very familiar with this because of your career, in the history of African American art and the canon or multiple canons that have been birthed from all of the, let's call them roadblocks that might stop a Black artist from being canonized. There's always some point of extreme generosity where someone has said, this must be preserved, this must be saved, this must be protected, and I have to share it with as many people. You know, I even think of Their Eyes Were Watching God and how Zora Neale Hurston, I know this is a genre media shift, but how Zora Neale Hurston had died basically penniless and unknown. And it took another Black woman artist, another Black woman writer to come find her work and remind us all how significant that was. And in the processes of being able to take a huge collection, and I'm sure, you know, you've spoken before about a warehouse of collection, a storage of collection, take that collection and thoughtfully place it around the world is something that is a huge undertaking. That's a huge amount of labor. Even when you're doing it in the name of someone else, you know, you want to honor a friend this way, so you'll donate some of this. Even the process of sorting through those sketchbooks and those notes and those books, you know, we talked about the collection of books of poetry that you gifted to Skowhegan. Why specifically poetry? Why Skowhegan?
Skowhegan, because Skowhegan was important to me. I went to Skowhegan in 1961, and my time there was as important as any 2 months of my life, probably, you know. Someone paid for me to be in Maine to paint every day, in exchange for which I had to go turn out a light in the Still Life studio every night, walk through the woods to the side. I mean, this was the big deal. Why poetry? You know, I'm not sure why. I think I wrote to them and asked if they would like a poetry collection. It seemed to me that poetry and art are so tied. And so when I think the first group of books was when I left Washington, and then I've since added to the poetry collection there. And I've had many thank yous from people saying, you know, we're using the poetry collection. It's great. So I mean, that's, you know, that was a tie of mine. But I was recently there for my work with David Driscoll. They were honoring David Driscoll. He had a show in Portland, and so I was there on a program related to his legacy. I've worked with African American artists for many years, and one of the first things I felt I learned, which was immensely powerful to me, was the pride, which is what you're talking about, that you would go to collectors of white art. There was a kind of taking for granted of knowledge and legacy. You would go to Black collectors of Black art, and there would be a very strong sense of pride that this was an important artist who wasn't well enough known. My first writing was about Doc's Thrash in 1975. But that was really through the Philadelphia Museum, but Doc's Thrash's importance to the printmaking world in Philadelphia was so immense. But for example, Norman Lewis, who was much less well known than Romare Bearden, when I worked on my Bearden show, Bearden was not an unknown artist in either the Black or the white community. When I worked on Lewis, I would say he was not known in the white community. He was known in the Black community. And that pride in wanting to get the word out was of a sort I hadn't seen before, although it was true with Bearden, just to a lesser degree. That's an amazing and wonderful need to make known and sense of pride. And, walls of family photographs, very important. This is who I am, this is who my parents were, this is who my grandparents were. And that, is clear in the writing about Bearden as well. It's of another magnitude and quite extraordinary and very, very, very important to me always.
Absolutely.
Very important.
Something that I'm new to Philadelphia. I've only been here a year and some change, besides that little semester I spent here where we first met. And immediately, especially in spaces like the Woodmere, I've learned just how influential artists, there's so many art schools here, historically, so many art communities. I worked at Brandywine. I'm seeing this kind of undergrowth of connectivity and strength and also pride, of these various black, white, poor, rich art community connected to New York, not connected to New York, connected to the South, not connected to the South. All of these intergenerational exchanges that keep happening over and over again through this particular city, and in a place like the Woodmere that specifically celebrates Philadelphia artists. But one of the things that's unique about a place like the Woodmere is that it reveals how influential and powerful art teachers are. Mm-hmm. Larry Day was a teacher, and you've spoken extensively already on just how influential he is as a teacher in the classroom, meeting people, being a guest critic, but also how his work continues to be didactic. I think that's an interesting connection between his practice as a teacher and his practice as an artist, is that there's a huge connection, and we could call it a bridge between European Western art canons that have been pervasive through history and thought and philosophy, and the banal today moments, being able to say that something as significant as the birth of Venus could happen in a living room, that kind of imaginative space that the work opens up, I think is super significant, and something that's really beautiful about putting the sketches, the drawings, the paintings all together. You see process and thought and movement, and I love that you insist that the drawings are just as significant as the paintings. The drawings are their own work of art. They're their own capsule of thought. I love it. So that was an aside. So you said earlier that this was a long time coming, this exhibition and this catalog, which is very extensive. When you first started sorting through the collection, did you immediately imagine a show? Did you
Yes.
immediately imagine a retrospective?
Yes.
Multisite?
I don't remember how Multisite happened. I actually don't remember.
4 sites is impressive.
Well, 3 sites. There's now a 4th site, but the Gross McLeaf show was not part of the 3 sites. Well, but 4 sites in that it's going to the Owsley, and it could travel further. There have been other museums interested that, we're in the time of COVID where everything is on hold, postponed, canceled, delayed. It was quite fabulous that this 3-part exhibition actually happened at the time it was meant to happen.
Yeah.
Very, very few things have happened at the time they were meant to happen. And with 3 institutions with small staffs, mostly working remotely, it was a miracle. I don't use the word miracle often, but if there were miracles, that it was amazing. And just getting it together, David Beinman was supposed to make 3 trips here to organize the show, and COVID prevented the second 2, so we had lots of back and forth between he and me.
Did you select David?
I asked David if he would be interested.
Yeah. And he just took off with it.
He took off with it. He knew Larry. He knew the work. He knew Larry had many connections to British artists, not the art had connections to British artists. And so, and David and he had talked a lot. And I thought he would be a great person to make the selection and do the organization. And he did, do the organization the way it was broken down in the 3 venues. And, wrote a wonderful overview. So again, selected. I wanted. That doesn't mean, you don't select. You hope, and some things fall into place. I learned a long time ago, I worked in a museum, people talk about the curator. Well, the curator can't do the show without, in a place like the National Gallery, my knowledge is very limited because I was always working with 15 offices, and each of those offices did their own important thing. This did the fundraising, this did the labels, this did the catalog, this did the community outreach. I didn't learn how to do that because I was in a big institution. You learn much more by working in a small institution where you have to function as 5 people. If not 15.
Yeah.
And so, I'm used to the notion that sharing is not as well known as it should be, the importance of sharing, the importance of having help, of having people who work with and put things together.
I think we're playing charades. I think he's trying to tell me things.
Life is a game of charades. I think that's not bad. It's not bad at all.
I don't know if I'm the one to figure it all out. That's kind of how I felt about
You're not
rolling.
going to figure it all out. You're not supposed to figure it all out. It's not possible to figure it all out. Because there is no all.
There is no all.
There is no all. That's the point. Some of the all is outside. Some of the all is what you're bringing to it. Your all is different than my all.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. Your all is different than my all.
That's what keeps the work fresh.
And he wanted your all to be different than my all.
That's definitely what keeps the work fresh. I think that's one of the reasons you can keep having conversations about it. And why I think the work will continue to travel.
Together.
Well, as a curator with decades in the game, multiple catalogs and publications under your belt, could you speak to how important exhibitions are, how important the scholarship is in continuing a legacy?
Well, that's in flux too. Certainly for my generation and up to now, I would say very important. I have no idea how in the future websites, online blogs, I don't know what the digital generation, how the digital generation will change the answer to your question. Mm-hmm. I know what I think. I'm 80 years old.
Still very valuable.
I think people who are 40 years old might think totally differently. 80 and a half, as a kid would say.
I asked that question because, I'm, again, early in my career, and I'm writing for emerging early career artists, and I am curating early emerging artist shows, and I'm thinking of the foundation every time I write something of how this could help build their legacy later. I'm thinking of it as a conversation across time where whatever the artist is into in the moment has to be understood as just the beginning of, or the foundation of, or the inkling of, or maybe the early mistakes of an artist who is going to have a long career. Is the hope, it's the wish casting that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And I think on the opposite end of that, after having worked on the Air show, what is important after an artist has died? What is important, you look back through their shows and their timelines, their chronologies, and in their archives, all of the shows they've done. And I was thinking, like, the people he has written the most extensively about himself. like which is valuable in itself, that primary source, but how essential it is to have another scholar come in and put it in new contexts, or multiple scholars come and put it in new contexts. And then I think about this show and how it's bubbling into multiple shows, because it's got another show, who knows how many shows will spread out of this, and how the work will travel, how important this catalog is to travel with it, and the context that the scholars that have been collected here, their voices add to the imagery.
I think it's very important. I think it's useful to have multiple people writing about someone. I mean, there are people I've written about many times, and I've said to them, ask somebody else. You don't need me again. Ask somebody else. And it also depends on how you rethink what you're doing. But I think every public presence of every sort is important. I think the more contributors there are, the better. I think if there's conflict, that's fine. Why should there be one opinion? Larry would be the last person. I mean, certainly, it was always Duchamp's notion that the viewer completes the picture. And certainly Larry believed strongly that the viewer completed the picture, that you set out a certain group of premises, and once it was out of your hands, it was out of your hands. And the viewer will respond based on the viewer's own life experience.
You have another title for the show, or a subtitle.
Finished enough. Finished enough.
Can you tell the people why?
I think Larry always did what he thought was enough to put across the point he wanted to make. He put in, it's about the folds, and it's about that surface. It's not about that hand. Often there's a geometric structure that's very important. The objects are very important. Objects are always very important. But I think he wrote with as few words as necessary, and drew and painted with the number of marks that he thought would tell his story. So I don't think of him as unfinished any more than I think of Cézanne as unfinished. Mm-hmm. It's finished enough.
It's finished enough. I love that. As a practicing artist yourself, what and as the curator and cultivator to a certain extent of his legacy, what advice would you give to artists in thinking early in the middle of their career of preserving and creating an archive?
The biggest advice I would give to artists is to date their work. I mean, Larry dated almost nothing.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't in a show with a date attached to it, and obviously most things were not, he did much more work than he ever had in public exhibition. And so most dates are circa dates because that's the best I can do, generally based on process. I mean, he drew in a certain way later rather than earlier. It's more difficult with the paintings, but if I can relate the paintings to drawings. Artists have to do what they have to do in order to do what they have to do. If they can afford assistance, most of them can't afford assistance. If they want to take the time to be organized, good for them. A lot of them don't know how to be, don't want to be, use materials that will last if they can fit into your budget and if the agenda for your work. I mean, much work is made not to last. Yeah. And so you can't advise to use, I mean, somehow I feel like the answer to every question you're asking me is that it's unique to each artist. And in a way, that's what I think the answer is here. But I think if you're making things that have permanent, or not permanent, long lives, as opposed to disintegrating within the decade, dating it would be very helpful, both to yourself, and artists don't remember. It doesn't matter to them. You know, you can ask an artist when something was done, and you don't know. And everybody has different ways of, you know, I mean, even things like additions. Frank Stewart, that I'm working on a show with, he truly believes every work he does is unique. Some of them are signed as part of an edition, some of them are signed as artist proofs. But the truth is, he feels every time he prints something, he's printing it at that moment, and it's that moment that matters. And some people feel very strongly about vintage photographs. He feels very strongly that as the technology gets better, you take advantage of the better technology and you print by the better technology. Some photographers would disagree with that completely. Some curators would disagree with that completely. You have to convince the curators that if this is what the art... I'm a curator who believes that the artist is boss. That the artist should make the rules, not the curator. Many curators, I do believe the curators should make the rules.
I like that a lot. My next question, what makes a good art teacher?
Depends on who the student is. I think a good art teacher is one who pays attention to the students and responds to the students' work, as opposed to coming into the classroom with an agenda they want to teach. And I think even if you come into the classroom with a project list, that's different than an agenda, because if you give out a project, everyone's going to respond to that project based on who they are. If you respond to what they do based on what you see rather than who you are, then I think you're a good teacher.
All right, last question. What kind of games, if any, did you and Larry play?
Scrabble.
Would you win? Would you win?
Oh, we'd both win.
Yeah.
We were both pretty good at Scrabble. He played, he played poker every week, or every month, but he and I played Scrabble.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for joining us today and for your generosity.
My pleasure.
Body Language, The Art of Larry Day closes here at the Woodmere Art Museum on January 23rd. It is the final of the 3 iterations and will open in a new iteration on February 24th at the David Owsley Museum of Art at Ball State.